All right, Laura, we're live. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
So, how have you been? I think we saw each other, maybe cross paths in the same skyrise we used to live in downtown, but I don't think I've seen you since, right? So, what's been going on in your life?
Well, moved out of the high rise in downtown, but perhaps more interestingly, wrote a book. That was a pretty big thing that I was focused on this year. My first time writing a book, so that was a pretty big challenge and adventure.
What I've always been pretty fearful to write a book. It just seems such an undertaking. Although I did one night, I just had a rocket at my ass or something, and I just created 16 chapters of the book I would write.
Nice.
I was just thinking of chapters. So what's the process of writing a book? It sounds like so much work to me.
It did feel like a lot of work. um, so I don't think there's any one right way to do it. I have a co-author, and so that definitely helped. And we actually worked with a writing coach, which I found super helpful. So, we knew what we wanted to write about because we had developed our culture model following our work with NASA. So we knew what we wanted to write about. But as far as like how to structure it and what to include and all of that, like having somebody who was really experienced and working with other book authors was very helpful. And it gave an incredible amount of external accountability. Like if we didn't have those weekly meetings with her, I would have made so many excuses for myself to not do it, to not get around to it. Because a lot of the book was written like mornings, early mornings before the day got started and weekends. And if I didn't have that meeting, I would be like, it's fine. I'll write this chapter next week. I would have just pushed it off. But we were able to power through and really get the book written in about 4 months. And then, editing and doing some revisions and layout and all that kind of stuff. But we powered through once we decided to go ahead with the writing.
Where is my copy of this book?
So we've got the Amazon print on demand, and my business partner who's down in Merritt Island actually has his supply right now of hard copy. And then we've got some like hardcover books that are coming our way later this month. It just came out in September, and there's been some supply chain issues, which have been super fun to deal with. But I will absolutely get you a copy, Jeremy. I promise. I'll sign it and everything.
Wow, supply chain issues. I haven't heard of anything like that going on.
No.
Just kidding. So is the co-author the gentleman that's on your Gallaher Edge website?
Yeah, Dr. Phillip Meade. Yeah, okay. Brilliant man.
So I definitely want a copy, and I actually just wrote down an idea for a book. Anyway, not to get sidetracked, but I appreciate you sharing that because I'm already like stoked about this idea just based on what you shared. So you're an organization, or I didn't go to college, Laura, as you can tell, because I can't
Jeremy.
speak for
it's okay.
organizational psychologist. So I know you, from what I think that is, this is just my ignorant view of that, is you help people or help companies and people within those companies have better culture. Is that what, explain what it is, but do a better job than my guess.
That's pretty good. I like that layperson explanation. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's what we specifically focus on. We work with leaders to help them align their cultures from the inside out. So yes, I'm an organizational psychologist, which, that's psychology is understanding, explaining, and predicting human behavior. So organizational psych is doing that in the context of a company or an organization. And so that's my background. That's my expertise. And my business partner is an industrial engineer. So, and he's actually got 3 different engineering degrees. So when you think about something like company culture, which is pretty abstract and it's pretty complex, and then you think about how is that handled when you put together a psychologist and an engineer, that's what we do. Like that's what our company is all about. And so it's a pretty comprehensive way to look at culture, because people have all different things that they think about when they think about culture. Some people are like, oh yeah, like potlucks and, holiday parties and ping pong tables and like, sure, like that, those are some visible artifacts. Those are some components of culture. Other people think about it totally as like, oh, like team building, like team building sessions and trust falls and, you know, and then there's other people that understand that culture is this like crazy emergent property of organizations that you can't actually work on directly. So you have to be able to understand like what are the forces that actually drive an organization and how can the leaders pull levers that they actually control to create the culture they want. So that's what we end up bringing to leaders.
Yeah, I mean, my entrepreneur brain is just thinking this is just a much higher upside of compensation than a traditional psychologist, because you're dealing with corporations, and especially in today's hiring market, that just makes you more valuable because companies can't afford to have people leave. So
yeah,
I imagine there's massive business opportunities when it comes to that, because I mean, I care not, we don't have a giant team, but I do my best to kind of lead the culture on our end. And what is funny though is I'll see, and maybe it's an age thing. It's probably not as much as an age thing, and you're way more of an expert on this than me. But I was at this lunch and this presentation, and it was this like these construction owners talking about how now because the labor market's so tough, like for the first time in 20 years, they took their staff and their family on like a trip to Universal or something. And they're like so proud of themselves. They're like, wow, the team was so happy, and it was such a big investment. And I could just tell like that was the first time the owners really ever given a shit. And in my mind, I'm just like, it just gives me a lot of confidence and like appreciation for what we have with our team, because we're far from perfect, and I'm learning every day. But we do daily shares within Slack. We do weekly activities where we get like vulnerable and share things, and we really try to promote like a good culture, and it definitely creates a close-knit community within the company, as well as from a company standpoint. And I'm not even doing this to like promote what you do, but it definitely helps with retention, you know, because probably all of our team members could leave and get higher paid jobs elsewhere or something, or at least like there's just so much competition in the marketplace right now.
So true.
Not that we don't pay well, we do, but like they have no shortage of opportunities if they wanted to leave.
Yeah.
So I do everything I can to try to give them reasons to stay outside of compensation. And I think what you do is a big part of that. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I do. I mean, I think that retention, that's probably where people's heads go a lot first and foremost, because I think, you know, having a good culture means people want to be there. And yes, to a large degree, that's very true. There's this quote that we really like. I'm pretty sure it's somewhere in our book, from Lou Gerstner. And so this was, you know, back in the 90s, early 90s, I think. He led a pretty massive turnaround for IBM. And it was a multi-year process. And he said that in that venture, he learned culture is not just one aspect of the game. It is the game. Culture is everything about how your organization works. Like, it's not just, do we like it here? Do we have, you know, happy people? I think that matters, but it's like, no, like, do we get stuff done? How well do we work together? Do we have anybody working at cross purposes? Not with bad intention, just like misalignment on goals or priorities. And so, you know, culture is everything about how the business operates. We don't look at it as like something to invest in separate from business results. It absolutely has to drive business results. I mean, the reason that we got into this work is that the Columbia accident, the Space Shuttle Columbia accident, happened in 2003, right? So that was the second shuttle program disaster for NASA. And Columbia disintegrated upon reentry, and NASA lost all 7 astronauts. So, of course, they did a big investigation. And they, you know, from a technical component, there was a piece of foam that fell off the tank during the launch, and it punctured a hole in the wing of the orbiter. So the heat shield couldn't withstand returning through the Earth's atmosphere. But the investigation said that culture was as much to blame for the accident as the piece of foam itself. So you would think like, oh, okay, so NASA's culture was like toxic. It was terrible. People hated their jobs. You had overbearing leaders. No, it had just been rated the #1 place to work in the federal government. So you literally have like rocket scientists, some of the smartest people in the world. They're some of the most engaged people. They're so into what they're doing. They're very satisfied with their jobs. But culture is to blame for a series of decisions that resulted in the death of 7 people. Like, wait, so what the hell is culture? Like, what is culture? And so it raises really important questions about all those forces that are at play that ultimately shape the beliefs and behaviors of the human beings who have the best intentions, but sometimes can just go down really dangerous roads. Now, for most companies, you're not looking at life and death, which is fortunate. But there's all kinds of things that can happen with company culture that has a huge impact on business results. So yeah, employee retention is big and it's super important, especially in today's market with the war for talent. And that's just one outcome. I mean, this can absolutely be a huge driver of revenue and top line, bottom line, all those like businessy metrics the leaders really care about. We care about them too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and I guess what was the big problem with NASA's culture? I guess, do you still work with NASA?
No, I don't. I was with them for about 7 years, 8 years. And so Dr. Phillip Meade, who we talked about at the top of the show here, he was the one who was asked to lead the culture change initiative at Kennedy Space Center. And as he looked into culture, he was like, oh, there's this whole field of organizational psychology. And so he hired a team of organizational psychologists that included me. And so that's how we became introduced. And, we worked together for a few years there. And now we work together in this business with all different industries. And so, part of why we wrote the book is because culture is complex. And we love to try to take things and make them really simple and like boil it down. Like there was even a headline, back in 2003 that's like, oh, the Columbia accident came down to a single conversation. And it's like, wow, that's a really ignorant perspective of, how things happen. So anything that I say about it is not going to fully do justice to the whole story. But there were some decisions that were made before the mission even happened where they said, like, when foam falls off the external tank, that's not an in-flight issue. And they didn't really have a good rationale for that, except that it hadn't created an in-flight issue before. And so there's a term called normalization of deviation. Something deviates from what it's supposed to be, but if nothing catastrophic happens, then we become like, we're like, it's okay. Nothing bad. Okay. And then the next time that happens, we're like, it's okay. Is it okay? It's okay. And the more it happens, the more okay we are with it. But the reality is we have deviated away from what is truly safe and what's truly okay. But it's like that slippery slope piece. And so that was part of what was happening. And they decided we don't have to worry about foam strikes during the mission. We will deal with any damage to the orbiter before we launch it for the next one. And so it's useful to understand that that was a decision that was made. And so you're already asking the engineers to really go up against high level decisions. Like you're asking them to say, hey, I know you've already decided this doesn't matter, but I'm really concerned. Oh, do you have data for that? Well, the data say anything from completely acceptable to total catastrophe. So not really. We actually kind of want to get more data. Can we get more data? Oh, you want to get more data on this thing we've already decided is not an in-flight issue? Like that's a big ask. And there were 3 different that we're aware of, 3 different asks that were made. So people were already like putting themselves out there to say, hey, I think we do need more data. But it was like through different triangulation, people weren't communicating directly with the mission management team. The mission management team wasn't going directly to these teams who were expressing the concern. And so with incomplete information, it got shut down. The request got shut down. And so it's a little bit like an ostrich burying its head in the sand, like, oh, I don't even want to know if it's an issue. But it's not done with any kind of callousness. It's like, why are we spending any time on this? We've already made a decision. This is not a concern. And so that's just like a high level picture of how communication can fall apart, and being able to recognize how vulnerable it is to be in any one of those positions, to be an engineer in a culture that has a motto of, in God we trust, all else bring data, and say like, I don't really have data, but my gut says I'm worried. Like, that's super vulnerable. And to do that up a level or 2 or 3 or 4 within the organization. And it's super vulnerable to be in the mission manager seat where, you know, she was responsible for safety and technical and budget and schedule, all of it. And she was dealing with pressure from Congress to complete the International Space Station. Like, the space shuttle program was constantly on the chopping block. It was constantly like, they might cancel the whole program. So we cannot fall behind schedule. We have to make sure that we finish. And so the constant schedule pressure in the CABE report, sorry, that's an acronym, the Columbia Accident Investigation Board report, they were like, of course, like, schedule pressure played a role in decision making, not consciously, but subconsciously, of course it did. There were like screensavers people had with a countdown to the deadline of finishing the International Space Station. So there's just so many different forces that can affect beliefs in ways that we're not fully aware of, that make having the really important conversations much harder than it has to be.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I would say that's applicable to almost every major issue in society right now, is that it's not as simple as what maybe the media or just kind of the high level most popular opinion on certain things is. There's very, very complex things, which I actually want to dive into some of those with you, because if you know anything about my podcast, if you've listened, Laura, I talk about business, but I also talk about whatever is interesting to me. And sometimes, you know, it can get a little off of a tricky path. But when I look at your background, which is very impressive from an education standpoint, a master's and a PhD in organizational psychology. I was practicing it in my head, saying it out loud there. So I said it right this time.
You nailed it.
But, and I mean, licensed human element practitioner, which, I mean, where my mind goes in 2021, and like, the more educated I feel is and nowadays, like, you're 1,000 times more educated than me for sure. But I feel like in today's time, it goes down to like, that person's super like liberal, like almost like pretentious. And maybe that's my prejudice, which is, and I just want to talk just like a little bit about that, because we go in policy by policy, I'd probably be like, I'm like a classic liberal or libertarian by definition. I lean left on a lot of things, but I think we're going through a really interesting time where it's just, I feel like, why do you feel that like the schools now have such a negative connotation with being left leaning? And I feel like it's getting worse. And I know I'm just like ranting right now about this subject, but that's where my head goes, as somebody that I think grew up in like a small town conservative. I kind of shifted left when I got like in my 20s. And then the last couple of years I've shifted right, because I just see the crazy things that are like going on. Like, what is your opinion on like high levels of education and like the correlation between like liberal ideology?
I mean, I've definitely heard that sentiment, you know, the connection between education and being liberal. It's obviously not an absolute. I know plenty of people who are highly educated who are very conservative.
Statistically, though, statistically, the more educated you are, the more left-leaning you're going to be. Why do you think that is, from your experience?
So this is really not rooted in anything other than my opinion. I'll caveat that. But I think that education really encourages people to think critically. I think education encourages people to challenge whatever it is that they maybe previously thought to be true about the world. And by its very nature, conservative is about holding on to things, conserving things from the past. and liberal or being like more progressive is about like, hey, like, are there any ways that we've been living that are maybe stupid, or like, are there better ways for us to think about things? And so that might be one thought, is that we're just really invited to think critically and challenge the status quo, whereas conservative is more traditional, specifically rooted in, let's hang on to our roots, let's hang on to the things that historically have made us who we are. And, you know, I think
that's a good thought. And I would agree with that completely. Is there what I feel like we're going through in modern times, and just say, call it 2021. We're recording this early December of 2021, is certain social issues. I almost feel like there's a segment of society that's just continuing to go progressive. It's almost like new problems are being created in the act of some sort of progressive ideology or modern day religion, when like things have already progressed really far. And I think that's where even just moderate thinking people that, like, I mean, most people consider themselves open-minded, by the way. I learned that in a persuasion book. If you ask people, I may have shared that with you before. I do it all the time. You ask people if they consider themselves open-minded, basically everybody will say yes. And then you ask the question you're trying to persuade them to do after that, and they're much less likely to say no to that because they just said they were open-minded. So everybody feels that they're open-minded, but where's the line? Like, is in theory, like, can we keep progressing? Is there always room for progressing? That's kind of what I'm asking, because I feel like we're getting at a point where it feels like it's like going extreme and not really progressing for human benefit in ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to probably define progress. You know, whatever direction you're going, whatever end state or future state you're trying to create, like that's for each person to be able to define and figure out for themselves. So societally, you know, when it comes to social issues, I think that I sort of see two big buckets. You know, one is, hey, can we really allow ourselves to be honest about some things in our history? Because pragmatically, a lot of us were taught a bunch of garbage in history. And so,
give me an example though, because I hear that a lot, and I don't think that's true. I don't know what history people are declining to hear. I mean, I think 100% slavery, for example, 100% of Americans know what slavery was, and I would say 99+% of them agree it was a very, very, very bad thing. So do you disagree with that?
That people acknowledge slavery and think slavery is bad?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. So, I mean, like, we just had the
what's another
Thanksgiving
area
holiday,
though where we don't,
right? I mean, what's Thanksgiving all about? Like, oh, you know, happy days from Columbus, like coming over on the Mayflower, and the fabulous like greetings with the Native Americans or the Indians or whatever, you know, misnomer we put on them. Is that how that was? Like, do we want to believe that version? You know, I mean, didn't you learn that crap in like elementary school?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of and I agree. We could probably, which by the way, that's kind of what I've been saying very vocally, like on social and in my podcast and within my friend group. Like Cleveland Indians, for example, instead of changing their name, there's an opportunity to educate people about the history of Native Americans. Like, I don't think removing names does anything. I think if anything, there's negative. Now, it's just being talked about even less inherently because of that. But I definitely know there was a lot of violence that came to what that was, but that's kind of the history of the world. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know what part of world history didn't have a lot of war and violence. So
yeah,
like, I guess,
therefore what?
I think what Thanksgiving is and what it stands for, I think is a little bit more modern and is not like not owning history.
So you're saying you don't think Thanksgiving fails to own history? It's just a modern holiday now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Thanksgiving fails to own history at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important and what doesn't happen a lot is, are we willing to listen to each other? So like if you met somebody who felt actually personally offended by the holiday, would you feel the need to defend the holiday, or would you be inclined to hear their perspective and understand what it means to them?
100%. I mean, you're my 50 something episode on the podcast that a lot of people I don't agree with on everything. Mm-hmm. So that's literally, I have a commitment to do that on a public level. Mm-hmm. So I would say I'm extremely committed to hearing other people's sides. I mean, so what's the solution? What are you proposing? Canceling Thanksgiving, or just like saying, hey, I just want to put an asterisk on Thanksgiving. There's a lot of accuracy to this, but the European settlers did kill a lot of Native Americans. We just want to let people know. Like, I guess, what are you proposing as the solution?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's one of the challenges is, we try to jump to, okay, so what's the answer? I don't know. I think having the conversation and increasing awareness is important. I mean, I think there are probably some like companies, for example, that no longer honor Columbus Day for Columbus Day. I think it's now simultaneously like a Native American, I don't know if it's Day of Mourning or like, so there's certain shifts that are happening where maybe we're no longer holding somebody up as like an icon or an idol of like, oh, this wonderful human from our history. And we're like, actually, there were some extremely flawed components of how this human walked the face of the earth. And maybe we don't want to honor him like he's some kind of icon. Like there could be things like that. I mean, changing holidays. I don't know.
I mean, this is where I feel is just a very extreme measure, because not that I really care either way too much about Columbus Day, but that was a time when that's just a much different time in world history. I mean, that's tons of wars were fought, lives weren't valued in the same way. I mean, it's just a much different time. Like, there's reports of Martin Luther King Jr., like, rumors of him treating women very poorly. Like, should we just, like, not, like, should we rename all the streets in the country and remove MLK, or just say, hey, like, he did a lot of good things and he also did a lot of bad things, just like almost every other human in world history.
Yeah,
like,
I think it's just really important to be aware of what are we idolizing and what are we saying, yep, that's okay. Like one of the things that we do with our clients is we help them understand that your company culture is driven by the worst behavior allowed by leadership. Your culture is not like an average of how everybody shows up. If you as a leader say, yep, this behavior is fine, whatever that lowest denominator is, like that worst performance, that worst behavior, the worst conduct, the worst treatment of another human being, you're saying, yep, that's my culture. And it changes how people look at culture and look at behavior and look at what are the trade-offs they're willing to make. Are they willing to take somebody who is a huge contributor to revenue, but just steamrolls people and like does not align with the values of the company at all? Are you willing to let that person go? Are you willing to let go of a client who's maybe a big source of revenue if continuing to serve that client gets in the way of you being able to create the culture that you want? And there are strong cultures and there are weak cultures, and that doesn't mean good or bad. A strong culture means we are extremely clear for ourselves about who we are and what kind of culture we want to have. Weak cultures are like, that's okay this time, and that's not okay this time. And like they're just all over the place and they're not well defined. So I think our culture is a little bit all over the place. We're not consistent in terms of what we say is okay or not okay. I think that we have the opportunity to go through a bit of a revolution or a rebirth and figure out what's okay and not okay here. I think we've been saying what's important to us without making it true. And you go back and do some of the real basic history, like, oh, we want freedom for all men. So first of all, notice that it's just for men. That's obviously not inclusive and not okay with the majority of the world's population today, or at least this country's population. But it was also talking about we're all free. No, well, it was white men, and specifically like home owning white men. Like it wasn't, you know what I mean? So it's like here's what we're all about.
I guess,
but it wasn't true.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Extremely self-serving for a small proportion of society.
That's not the truth in 2021, though. So, I mean, I guess, like, I don't know who doesn't know that that's the history. I guess, like, what is changing Columbus Day and, like, what you're saying, I don't know who's denying the history there.
You're not aware of anybody who denies some of the history of the genocide? The
history that men weren't, I've never met any person that doesn't understand that men were, especially wealthy white men, ran the country as we first started, and it's progressed from there to the point where we are now, where, again, not that there's not continual room for growth, but we've come a long way. I mean, I could argue that, like, non-wealthy white men maybe have some of the biggest disadvantage in business and opportunities today.
What's that argument?
Wealthy people and
What's that argument?
People from, let's say, my hometown, really low income. There's not the same level of affirmative, like, what's where the, like, colleges are forced to, is it affirmative action? Is that where colleges are forced to balance out the, like, different races and ethnicities?
Who forces colleges to do anything?
There's, like, requirements by federal law that they have to have a certain percentage of, like, Black, Asian, white, etc.
Is there federal law?
Yeah, affirmative action. Yeah, I'm going to Google it right now. So it's definitely, again, and I'm not, if you're wealthy in 2021, regardless of race, which, by the way, a lot of the stuff you're talking about, like, we can probably agree on a majority of it. I'm not going to say 100% of it, but a majority of it. I think it's such small, needle-moving stuff, and I think it's, like, a huge distraction by design from much more important things in society, like drug decriminalization. I mean, there's literally multiple six figures of people in prison still for nonviolent crimes,
yeah,
disproportionately minority, which we can agree.
Disproportionately.
And we're here talking about Columbus Day. There's big.
I mean, I just threw that out there.
Inequality.
I certainly wouldn't make that the sword to fall on for myself. It was just an example of, like, he's held up historically. When I was a kid, he was held up as a hero, and that is some bullshit. Like, that's craziness to look at that now. I mean, I'm in my 30s. I'm not, like, so old so that was just an easy example to pull on.
Is he held? I mean, what's wrong with him being held up for what he did as a positive? Like, you can have two thoughts in your head at the same time. You can say, hey, if it wasn't for Christopher Columbus, which I know maybe there's other data now that somebody else founded the country and the Native Americans were here first. Maybe he was the first European settler, maybe not, and whatever. But can you say, hey, he did a lot of screwed up things? Also, if it wasn't for Christopher Columbus, like, Europe may have never started settling here. And, like, can we have two thoughts at one time? Like, can we just...
So what if Europe never settled here?
I don't know.
Yeah. So what kind of communities might be thriving here on this land if Spain wasn't trying to conquer the whole world? Like,
I mean, you could argue that for everywhere in the world, though. I mean, like, just...
So, yeah, what like,
what would Scotland be if England never, like, invaded them right now? Like, I don't know, but that's just, like, world history. I don't know, but that's more of my point is, again, this conversation, I think, is conversations that we hear a lot, like this type of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think it's, like, the biggest waste of brain energy. And it's, I feel that I can come up with, like, 10 of them right now, but college loans, big pharma, drug laws, prison reform, all that stuff is, like, a million times more of an important conversation. And I just feel like things we're talking about now, I even think the race issue is way blown out of proportion. It's a much bigger class issue. If you have wealth in this country, which is disproportionately, you're less likely to have wealth if you're not white, for sure. But if you're a Black or Hispanic wealthy person, like, it's very hard to convince me that you have disadvantages. It's class issue. And I know a lot of it has to do with history. Again, like I know, like I'm not denying history, but I just think we just waste our time and focus on a bunch of little issues that don't move anything forward.
Well, and that's why I said, like, what does it mean to be progressive? Where are you going? And not everybody has the same idea about what progress is. Not everybody agrees on what the biggest problems are. That happens in organizations too. One of the hardest things I can ever get my clients to do is sit down and have a conversation and say, what is the one highest priority? Not like these are the 7 highest priority. Like, what is the one highest priority? If nothing else gets done, what is the one highest priority? They hate that conversation. That is so hard for them to have because they don't agree. And they're in the same company. And we're not talking about solving like problems of society in the world. We're talking about businesses. And it's so challenging for people. So, you know, as a society, we don't all agree on what's important and what's valuable and what problems we want to solve. Our focus is divided, but each human gets to pay attention to what they want to pay attention to.
That's true. I just feel like it's the opposite of progression in many ways, what so many humans are focusing on now. Like, not that, again, like, I feel like it's issues that affect such minimal amount of people. Like, that honestly, like, the Democrats would win way more elections if they didn't focus on some of these issues that I think are repulsive to more moderates like me. Because we went like healthcare, cool. I agree. Some basic form of healthcare, especially catastrophic, makes a lot of sense. Because if my child gets cancer, I don't think it's right fiscally for me to be in 6 figures in debt the rest of my life because I didn't have proper health insurance, right? Like, stuff like that seems so obvious and like such a progressive idea that I think a lot of the country could get behind. And it's just like, why is that? Why aren't those bigger ideas? So I'll ask you this as a psychologist. Why aren't those ideas that I think we both can agree on and a lot of country can agree on, those could impact the country in such a good way? Why isn't that a major part of discussion more than it is? Why would you think?
Because it's really complicated. Because people look for a simple solution. You know, I talk about a silly example like Columbus or the Thanksgiving holiday, and you jump straight to, so what's the solution? I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. There could be an invitation to talk about it. You don't want to talk about healthcare. People have to understand healthcare. They have to understand all of the variables, or at least some concept of it, in order to make informed choices. And it's complicated. They don't want to spend the time to understand it.
So you're just discrediting like people's intelligence or motivation to learn. I don't think it's that complicated to learn. Like, and I actually see you put self-accountability as one thing that you really are serious about, but I don't view that as a good excuse in 2021. There's more access to information than ever before.
That actually makes it harder, Jeremy. Like, so part of self-accountability is owning whatever choices you make. I personally have no plan or no intention to dive into the depths of all the challenges associated with coming up with universal healthcare. It's not something that I personally am going to put any time into in the near future. That might change. Something might happen in my life where that becomes a priority. But right now, that would be a huge distraction for me. And I don't even know what I would do with that. I don't have any kind of plan. I don't regard myself as like a bad person for that. And it's not that I'm not motivated to learn it or learn in general. It's like, that's not my focus.
I don't think it has to be I think you could spend an hour or two doing research and say, hey, I know my efforts have been focused on, I'm not saying you, I'm just saying and I know this is an extreme small percent of the left party, to be clear, but like, let's say pronouns, focusing on the proper use of pronouns, which again, I think is, not that it's, if someone asked me to call them something and I probably would just call them whatever they want. I think most people are kind of on that page at the same point. I do think it's getting forced down throats a little too much at this point. But that's an example of something. It's like, hey, probably not super important, but maybe it is to that individual person.
Of course it is to that individual person. I mean, that's That's what this is all about. That's the challenge. As soon as it becomes like, you shouldn't care about that, or this thing that's really important to you isn't important to me and I'm right, like that's problematic. We don't agree on what's important.
Isn't that the opposite of progressiveness, though? If we're just focused on like what is important to us, like what I'm talking about too is like way more impactful for society as a whole. And I'm not saying you're obviously good at what you do. And I'm not saying you should stop anything you're doing, but I think you could spend a day in the next 5 years and just get a high level understanding of politics in this country and be well informed to like have a basic debate or like vote on something. You know, I'm not saying everybody should be an expert on it.
Yeah. Like, I mean, and any one of those issues, like even making a determination of like what issues would have the biggest impact on society, that takes a lot of research as well. Like it takes a depth of understanding to really know if we solve this one problem, what is the impact? And having the systems theory view and really being able to understand cascading impacts, and like maybe it impacts these things in a positive manner, but it screws this stuff up. Being able to understand that for any of the major potential problems that we could go after, that is a giant thing in and of itself. Like, of course it's difficult for people to come together and say, this is the one thing that we should figure out and solve. This is the one most important problem. Of course that's difficult. I mean, any group of people can come together and they can say, here is the future vision. Here's where we want to go. We're going to get on the same page about the kind of organization that we want to have, where we're going to be in 5 years, the kind of society we want to live in. Those conversations take time. And when I do them with leaders, that takes time. We're just talking about that company. You want to try and do that for like a whole country or a whole society, paint a future vision that everybody agrees on. It's a big undertaking. You got to figure out,
it's
like,
impossible.
But
probably.
That's what, you talk about progress. Everybody's definition of what progress is going to be based on the future vision that they see in their minds. If we're not on the same page, then of course we're not going to agree on like what's progressive and what's not, and what's a waste of time and what's not.
So this is, I think, a question that you would be really good at answering. So what's the largest company you've ever consulted with, or largest organization? How many people, roughly?
In terms of like more of an in-depth consultation?
Team. Yeah, like just any type of, I'm just thinking, like, have you consulted with an organization that has like 5 or 10,000 people in the organization?
Probably more like 1,500.
Okay, so pretty good amount of people. Like, I guess the question we should ask ourselves, and I think it's a very important for people of all political ideologies to ask, religions, political ideologies, beliefs, whatever. Like, do we want to all have an aligned culture? Because I think that's the first step, is all coming to agreement that we want to have some aligned culture. And I don't know if a yes or no is necessarily a bad thing, but getting clear on which one it is. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I ask about the company size because that's 1,500 people, which those are people that are there voluntarily. Like, they can quit and go get another job. Like, most of us are in this country because it's where we were born, or some of us are here voluntarily, but a vast majority are here because this is where I grew up and this is where I live, right? So is it possible, and then is it okay that we just all have a different vision? And I don't know what the solution is, but from your experience in dealing with larger groups, I mean, what's the likelihood that we can actually come together on a vision?
I think it's a really big challenge, and I think ego gets in the way. I mean, partly in the sense that people are focused on what's going to be good for me. I mean, that's just everybody's worldview. Like you, Jeremy, you don't see the world as it is. You see the world as you are, just like me. I don't see the world as it is. I see the world as I am. Our self-awareness drives how we view everything. And we're not even aware of all of the filters and biases that affect everything about how we see what we think we're looking at. Like nobody has an actual view of, quote, reality. That's not even a thing. Like you don't even respond to the world around you. You only ever respond to the meaning that you're putting on things that are happening around you or in front of you. It's always up here. It's only in consciousness. So from like a real like existential standpoint, I think that's useful to know. And that's going to create a huge challenge in terms of creating unity, especially when you talk about something as big as like a whole country, a whole society. But there are places that do create that. I mean, I think one of the most effective ways to do it is like put up your bat signal and attract the people who believe what you believe and want what you want. I actually think that that's what the United States of America really has worked to do in the past. I think it's been like,
that's why we have states.
Yeah, we're about freedom, you know, this is American dream, blah, blah, blah. Like that's what attracts other people to want to come and live in this country. And then some of what actually happens here is what makes some people choose to leave this country. So I think it's okay for people to want different things. If people are going to be in the same group, whether that's the same country, same society, same organization, same community group, whatever, is it okay that they want different things for that community or for that group? I don't know about okay. It's going to be fragmented. And so whatever that group is, society, country, church, community, like whatever it is, it's going to be more fragmented and it's going to have a harder time actually achieving its future vision. So I don't even know if it's about okay or not okay. It's like, what are we wanting to accomplish? We have to define success.
Yeah. The more I just kind of see what's going on in the world, I'm convinced that, and yeah, I mean, I think us just having a conversation is good, right? I'm not convinced. My libertarian viewpoint, which that's where I like disagree with I kind of have fallen in my own bucket. Like my conservative friends think I'm wildly progressive, and like my left-leaning friends think I'm like wildly conservative because I just have like a range of viewpoints. But libertarians at their core give people the benefit of the doubt to make the decisions that are best for their own individual lives. So like conservatives, and I talked to a lot of my conservatives about this, they're very like anti-mask, but they're or like where am I going? They're like okay with like anti-mask and kind of like knowing that COVID's going to spread because of it, but they're pro-life. And then liberals are the opposite. They're like, hey, every life matters here. We got to protect every life. We got to extend the life of 80-year-olds to 90, but we're pro-choice, right? So there's like two opposite viewpoints there, where libertarian I actually think is the most consistent viewpoint, which is you do what you want with your body as a woman, and you do what you want with a face on your or a mask on your face, whatever you want, which is kind of me. Just like let people do whatever they want to do. With that being said, and I'm only sharing this for a reason, I don't know if I have enough faith in society that it's a good thing to continue to try to push people's ideas together. Because you mentioned the excess information being a bad thing. I agree to a point, because there's so many smart people on so many sides of every equation that if you're in your information bubble, you're going to have so much good information to support your viewpoint. It's so difficult to like change that viewpoint, right? So I do agree with you there. And like the more and more I think a solution, like, and I don't know what it is, like, but states are a good start. And that's okay. Like, hey, I may not agree with what's going on in California. You know, they can live in California and I will respect their opinions in California. And like, people may think Florida's crazy. Like, I love Florida, right?
And we're crazy.
So we
Florida
are crazy, but that is wild though, that 250 years ago, the people that like had the vision for our country created like states or colonies or whatever, right? Because they knew people just had such different beliefs and they came from different countries. And I do think that's pretty special. And maybe, what do you think about that as the solution? Just saying, hey, like maybe states are the future, just really getting like owning the fact that we have different viewpoints and just being like, I'm not going to hang out with people that are different political points unless they're seriously willing to like have a conversation. But like, maybe it's different social channels. Maybe it's like, it already happens on cable news. Like, you know, maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah.
You know, like, I don't know what your thoughts are.
I don't think that the idea is that everybody has to agree or everybody has to think the same thing. I mean, part of what a society or any group of people can agree upon is to respect differences. like so we have this missing link culture model, right? Because we exist to evolve humanity. And specifically, we focus on evolving culture. And so diversity within our culture model is an emergent property that happens when you actually bring people together with differences and you regard those differences with respect and you're inclusive of those differences. And actually, the more you do that, the easier it is for every person to feel like they belong. Like that's the individual driver that's
Say that again.
So
say that part again.
The more you actually bring different people together where you are respectful and inclusive of those differences, it's easier to feel like you belong. So let me give you a really obvious example. Let's say that I walk into a room and it's just all white men. I might even subconsciously immediately wonder, like, do I belong here? Now, if I walk into a different room and I see white men and black men and Asian men, and I see women and they're Latina and they're Indian and they're like just all these different races, all these different people, and I look and I see everybody being included and respected, it doesn't even matter like what attributes of myself I perceive as different, because I look around, I see all the differences and all those differences are being included and being respected. So it's easier to feel like you truly belong when there are differences and there's inclusiveness around those differences in any kind of group.
Yeah.
Versus like, ooh, do I fit? Let me see if I can just, ooh, shoot, I'm different from them in these ways. I'm not sure if I belong here. Like the more homogenous an organization of any kind, a group of people, the more homogenous it is, the more anybody who's different anyway, even if it's beliefs. I could be a white dude too, walk in and be like, ooh, I don't know, I might be too liberal for these folks and question if I belong. But if the group has a whole bunch of like different beliefs politically and everybody's being respectful and inclusive, then I'm not going to even question or wonder if my beliefs are okay here, because I can see that diversity is valued.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually wanted to ask you about your viewpoint on the importance of diversity and inclusion. You just started touching on that. But with our group, Founders Mastermind, most of us are probably like in that libertarian. I feel like most entrepreneurs, especially like internet entrepreneurs I come across, they're just very like, let me do my thing. Don't tax me like crazy and just kind of don't bother me. So I think that by definition is some libertarian. But when I was getting clear on our organization's values, the one thing that I wanted to really stand for as an organization is like, we can disagree on healthcare. We can disagree on a lot of stuff. Some of us are pro-life in the group. Some of us are pro-choice. Like we talk about this, right? The one thing that I think is that we have to be consistent on is we're very pro-capitalism, and we want to give capitalism a good name. We want to do a lot of good with capitalism, right? Because there is a lot of good that can come with capitalism, starting with paying taxes, hiring people, giving people careers, giving people purpose, innovation. There's some bad things that can come from it. And so I think we want to be a group of people that care about doing good with capitalism as a forefront. So to your point, I guess what can we all agree on as a country? Is it that we are going to love our neighbor? I mean, what's like the equivalent of like capitalism with our group for the US? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like from your psychological brain, what is that? Do you know?
I mean, I think it's supposed to be about freedom. I mean, we're literally called the United States of America. So we're supposed to be united on something. And unity is another piece of our model, which is exactly what you're getting at, where you're talking about the things that in your group you have like different beliefs on, and that's fine. And you're looking for common purpose and common beliefs within unity. In our org culture model, like we want all those. We want to know where it's important that we agree. We want to know where it's valuable to have differences. For the United States of America, I think it's supposed to be freedom. But even that is something that we have to define. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. What does freedom mean to you?
To me?
Laura, what does a free mean to you?
I don't think I have a super clear answer, but if I think out loud around it, I think there's two buckets. There's freedom to, like, do I have the freedom to fill in the blank? And then there's freedom from. And freedom from is probably more internally driven. Do I have freedom from self-judgment, Do I have freedom from fear, especially fear of like judgment from others? And that's all stuff that I get to focus on for myself, right? Like I can create that. Only I can create that. There's a lot of, Viktor Frankl's concepts and his logotherapy stuff. Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor.
I've heard his name. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you would really appreciate his stuff. Man's Search for Meaning kind of thing.
Oh yeah. I haven't read that book, but I have it in my Audible. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so I think that that's an individual level of freedom that each person has the opportunity to work to create for themselves. That's part of like the self stuff. Maturity is another emergent property in our culture model. And that's all self-acceptance, self-awareness, self-accountability. That brings a lot of freedom. It brings a lot of empowerment. So the freedom from, that's something that I get to create for myself. Nobody else can do that for me. Freedom too, that might be me understanding like, what are the things that I can do without a severe negative consequence? And that's where things like laws come into play.
That's kind of where libertarians are like, again, it seems like the most American political viewpoint. It's like, I believe in people making their own decisions mostly, but this is where I get like kind of annoyed with like both parties have like their things that they view as their versions of freedom. And maybe they are like, again, like I gave the example of like the conservative that's pro-life, but is like anti any type of COVID restriction, which I'm anti COVID restrictions, but I'm also pro-choice. I'm just for people doing whatever they want. But I guess, yeah, it is complicated. I honestly, I don't know what any of these solutions are. But I do think technology adds a lot of fuel to the fire and rage, and I feel there's starting to be an awareness to be on our phones less, and to, especially with like my friend group. I mean, I feel like we give each other a hard time if we're on our phones too much.
Good,
which is a good thing. That's good. And I think that's gonna allow us to have less rage, less anger, less. So social media and Facebook and Twitter, it's just so toxic. Like the algos are generated, or like they're specifically there to frustrate you and make both extremes seem more common than they actually are.
Yeah, the whole echo chamber concept.
What do you, and I want to put the business hat back on right after I ask this question, but the importance of diversity and inclusion, you just talked about that. I'm assuming that's a conversation you have with like CEOs you work with within their organization, or I know you noted it in the notes before this combo, but do you have any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, some of our clients, it's part of what they're thinking of when they reach out to us, actually. Like, so in our culture model, when we talk about what makes an effective culture, we focus on 4 traits: maturity, diversity, community, and unity. And so we've touched on things like diversity and unity. Maturity is the root of it all. That's the self stuff. And what we really focus on, this is where we always begin, like our client engagements. And this is that whole freedom from thing that I think is so valuable. When every person understands how their own subconscious feels threatened by differences from others, and they recognize that that's distortion, that makes it a lot easier to have conversations around diversity and inclusion. And whatever that even means for people. Like some people hear that and they immediately think of like DE&I, and they think straight away about, race and gender and sexual orientation and affirmative action and, all that kind of stuff. Other people don't think about that when they think about diversity and inclusion, or they just think about having an inclusive environment.
You just said affirmative action. We just said affirmative action. You said you didn't know what it was.
No. No, I know what it was. I was questioning that universities are forced to do quotas. That you could be right. I hadn't heard about that. I feel like there are universities who make a conscious choice to say, oh shit, we have a crap ton of white dudes here. I wonder if we could be a better institution if we actively worked to change that. And they set their own goals to say, let's try to not have so many white dudes, because that's a lot of homogeneity. I'm aware of that.
Yeah, and I may have misspoke. It may or may not be required. I'll just have it brought up right here. If not, it's examples of affirmative action offered by United States Department of Labor include outreach campaigns, targeted recruitment, employee and management development, employee support programs. Definition: a set of procedures designed to eliminate unlawful discrimination amongst applicants, which I think it's evolved to maybe there's financial incentives. It may not be a requirement. Again, I don't know. I need to look into it, but it could be maybe more of a societal pressure with financial incentives or something.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I always hope that
the federal government can require
I always hope that people are internally driven. But, societal pressure actually creates the opportunity for people to decide that they want to internalize it and make it their own. I mean, somebody can comply for the sake of compliance. There's 3 basic ways we can respond to changes being imposed upon us. We can resist, we can comply, or we can internalize it and go, oh, I like this. I want this for myself. And so I think sometimes the role of government, and not everybody agrees with this, sometimes the role of government is to create compliance first. And then society comes around, and then it becomes the popular opinion, and then it is an internalized view. I think that's actually leadership. Now, again, not everybody agrees with that, but I think that that's part of what government exists to do, is to lead the country and say, okay, you know what? This business might lose money when we ask them to comply with these environmental laws now. And so let's offer them some financial incentives. And then over time, it stops just being like, hey, we can get some money if we stop polluting the planet. And then you get Gen Z coming out, and that's like, they're all about the planet. That's not.
They're not at all, though.
Well, whatever.
The Gen Z, I just want to clarify, because it's really important. Gen Z is heavily adopting crypto, which is horrible for the planet. A lot of Gen Z is very, very like Insta famous, TikTok famous. They have a surplus of tons of like. Bill Maher did a whole rant about this, how basically like the baby boomers get shit on, but Gen Zs are just like hypocritical, and listed all these things that Gen Zs like still do that are just like equally as bad for the planet. So I just want to say that they say one thing.
Well, do you think that
do
you think they intend to be hypocritical, or do you think that it's ignorance? Because my point is
probably ignorance.
My point is that they, even if they're misguided and they're still screwing stuff up, they have internalized this idea that we want to be good to the planet. They're not doing it because of
so did hippies in the 60s and 70s, you know. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you're right. The intention is there. They just haven't spent much time on Google researching things. So when we talk about diversity in a workplace, like, is there anybody that disagrees with that at this point that you work with? I mean, I feel like when I hear stuff like that, especially nowadays, I mean, I can tell you it's very hard to find people. Like, I just feel like it's so hard to find a good person in general. Like, it's whoever that good fit is, whatever. Is that not the definition of diversity? Or is that going out of your way to make sure you have a certain quota? Like, I guess, I think most entrepreneurs all, I've never heard one, even in private conversations, be like, I would have hired this person, but their skin color was different, or they're a Muslim, or like, we just want good people on our team, So I guess, is that the definition of diversity, having color blindness when it comes to getting the right fit? Or is it going out of your way to make sure you have certain viewpoints or certain races and religions and stuff?
I think it's more about going out of your way to create diversity within your organization. That's how I see it. Most people, I agree, most people won't actually say out loud things like, yeah, I would have hired him, but I didn't like his skin color. Like, that is extremely not socially desirable. Even if people think it, they're not going to say it. And we lie to ourselves all the time. So somebody might have an internal bias that is related to some of those characteristics that we say shouldn't matter, but that's not what they even tell themselves. In their minds, they conclude that this person wasn't a good fit because of XYZ reason. And there's actually something underneath that they're not even fully aware of. And that's something that I think is really important for white people to be aware of, is how much we have been programmed to favor white people.
Programmed from what?
Media.
Don't all races by design gravitate towards people they're most like to, though? Like Jewish community hangs out with Jewish community, Italians hang out with more Italians. Like, isn't that just part of like human tribal nature too? Not that like it's a conscious thing, but isn't some level of it subconscious?
Yeah. So in-group bias is definitely a real thing. I mean, we're very tribal creatures by our nature. So yeah, that's some of how we've evolved.
Why is it just white men though? Why is that the common one? Why isn't like black men or Hispanic men? Like, why is it?
Well, what's the history of power in this country in particular?
But the power isn't relevant from a, like, I'm just going to have a bias towards this.
So are you aware of any of the studies, for example, that show that like young black girls, when shown a white doll and a black doll, ask which one is prettier, disproportionately point to the white doll because that's what they see? Are you aware of any of those studies?
I've heard that.
Yeah.
I've heard that.
That's just one example, and there's a lot like that. Like, there are black children that, you know, have grown up in this country and they don't see themselves. They don't see themselves represented in positions of leadership. They don't see themselves represented in media. They're not the ones who are on the covers of like Glamour magazine. And so they look at themselves and they go, I don't fit that.
They are now though.
So
they are in 2021.
Starting to change. It's starting to change. Again,
it's not starting to change. There's tons of data that shows that there's a disproportionate amount of non-white people in major commercials now. There's VPs of diversity on like every Fortune 500 company that goes out of their way. I mean, again, not that there's not going to be always room for improvement, but I mean, there's data that shows like.
So, but what data are we looking for? Are we looking for the raw percentage today of just what's representation like? Do we want to take into account the last couple hundred years of what's been? I mean, path dependence is really important for understanding any kind of culture.
I am taking that into account. I am taking that into account. I'm just saying we've hit what I feel are a lot of strong targets.
Cool. So
interracial marriage is progress. Like the numbers are at a very, very we've made progress.
And there's more to make.
So what's the end? What's something more you think we can do? What's another area for growth from progress standpoint?
Well, I think that there's a lot of outcomes that we haven't yet seen. And there's not always a simple way to just say, oh, this is the one path to get there. But
give me an example of that.
The amount of white men in leadership roles in organizations. If we really didn't have a disproportionate power structure, then it would look different today. We're making progress, but we still have like far disproportionate number of white males in leadership roles in companies.
I would like to look at the data on that because I know that's heavily shifted. So I guess what would be let's look at the NBA, for example, which is, I know this is an extreme example on the other side, but it's 90+% black. And even the white people that are in the NBA are mostly European, you know, so it's very little American white men in the NBA. What is the opposite? Like, what do you think what does that go to? Because I think it's important. I think the African-American or black population is about 13% of the country. So if you're talking men specifically, they make about 6.5% of, I guess, what would be the target number where you feel we were progressing from a leadership standpoint?
If the demographics of human beings in leadership roles matched the demographics of the broader society that it's in.
But what about the opposite, which is what I'm saying, like pro athletes? It's predominantly, they make there's way more in the NBA and the, like, based on percentage of population, there's a lot more black Americans in, let's just say, the NFL and the NBA. What would be the opposite of that called? Like, is that?
Do you think that's a result of discrimination?
No.
Okay.
I guess the reason I'm asking that is the goal, like, how do we get to, so I guess if you're like, because we could go the men and women argument, which Jordan Peterson has this all the time, which his argument is that there's never going to be the same amount of women interested in engineering, for example, because women just don't like engineering as much as men, right? So there's like STEM programs specifically designed for women, which is great. Not that there's not some amazing world-class women on like engineers, but just biologically they may not gravitate towards engineering as much as like men may not care as much about like nursing or youth education or something, where women gravitate towards that sort of thing. So I guess that's kind of what I'm asking is like, is the solution to like within the percentage point to be like matched up based on each race's percentage of the population? Because then can we go like religion? Like what percentages like of the country is Jewish? Like the Jewish community owns a big chunk of the wealth in this country based disproportionate to population.
Yeah, there's all kinds of differences and different variables that you can look at and consider. I don't think there's a right one, but I just think that it's a good indicator if, let's just take a workforce as a whole. If the workforce as a whole is pretty closely representative of the labor force that's around it, like the potential labor force. If it doesn't fully represent it, I think it's an important question to ask of like, why?
Is it kind of where I'm getting to though? And by the way, like to be clear, like I would love to see as much diversification as the market will allow in all types of leadership positions. I mean, I think the free market is a really good thing. If you're a great company leader or you're a great entrepreneur, there's going to be a place for you in the market, right? But I think it's rooted more deeply, kind of what I'm saying, like within individual cultures and stuff. Like if you look at the Asian community, for example, like Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, I think Indian Americans. So Asia obviously is a giant continent. So I just wanted to break those up specifically. Or maybe it's Korean, Chinese, and Indian. But they all have like much higher income per capita than white people. And I would guess a lot of that is just because of the culture. You know, a lot of friends of mine that some of my Asian friends are just like, their family's super strict. Mm-hmm. They really value school. Mm-hmm. They really value education. They really value hard work. So that's where, when we talk about diversity, again, it's just a complicated thing.
I agree.
Like, how do we like navigate how parents are raising kids at home and telling them like what books to read as a little kid and all that stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's best not to dictate any of that. I think it's best to help people feel inspired. I mean, I think that's what culture can do. You know, how can a culture inspire parents to want to parent their kids in a certain way, not dictate it?
You know what I did see, I thought was pretty cool. I think it was maybe a year ago, could be a little older, but I think it was Chase and Kevin Hart, or like Chase Capital One. Maybe it's a separate company. I don't know. One of those companies, one of those banks created a partnership with Kevin Hart, and it was about educating on financial literacy to like kids in the inner city. And I was like, this is a genius partnership, because Kevin Hart, and I think he talked about it on Joe Rogan, but he's like, you know, a white guy in a suit, like, he's not going to be able to relate with a teenage black kid in the inner city, where like maybe someone like Kevin Hart could, and can talk about like, not like IRAs and like boring shit like that. Kevin Hart would talk about like, hey, like when you got an extra $100, don't be spending it on stupid shit, like invest it, you know, like Kevin Hart was just giving examples. But I do think things like that are really promising, and it's really exciting to me.
Yeah.
So thank you for diving down that rabbit hole with me. I want to ask you one more question that I think we'll put our business hats back on. What, from a team culture standpoint, and I know a lot of companies have shifted either hybrid or fully remote, right? Ours included. We're fully remote. Like what do you feel are the best ways to execute a solid company culture when you rarely or never get together in person? Like, are there any trends you're seeing? Are there any like best practices you see for fully remote teams?
Definitely have a lot of those right now. I mean, I had one or two clients before the pandemic that were already fully remote. I don't think there's anything that truly replaces in person. So that's one thing that I'll throw out right away is if you're a fully remote or if you're a hybrid, I think, I want leaders to create opportunity to bring people together in person with some kind of cadence. Maybe it's only once a year, maybe it's twice a year, maybe it's once a month. I don't know, but like, I do think that that's important. And I think that's worth investing in because I don't believe that there is a replacement for actually in person. I mean, there's legitimate like energy waves that exist between human beings and it is just different. So that's the first thing that I'll say. Beyond that, I think a lot of it is around intentionality. So, there's the classic examples, like we don't have as much just like water cooler chatter and like, oh, are y'all talking about that client? Let me share this useful information, or, oh, I'm glad I know that because it affects me in this way. Like that kind of accidental communication isn't going to happen in the same way. But I don't think that's terribly effective when that happens in organizations anyway. I think it's always useful to have intentionality around, who are we communicating and about what and when. And thinking through that, I think, is beneficial no matter what kind of workforce you have, whether you are virtual or not. But a lot of the culture really comes down to what are the interactions between the human beings. And so even if it is virtual, even if it's over video call or it's over phone call or it's over Slack or it's over email, like all those interactions, that's truly where culture comes from. And so there are things that you can be very clear about in terms of what's okay and what's not okay and how to really cultivate trust and all the things that you really want in your culture, no matter what the medium is. And I want people to bring leaders, or not just leaders, but bring people together. I still want that to happen.
Yeah, we're actually having our team retreat this weekend and we're flying everybody down.
Nice.
So it's good timing.
Good.
We're talking.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting time and we're talking. Some of them have been working with us for almost a year, a little over a year. We've never met in person until this weekend, So what is, I know I said one question, but I have like another question. Like, how do you best communicate your culture and try to find a good culture fit when hiring new people you feel for a virtual or fully remote company?
So I'm thinking about my answer because my whole doctoral dissertation was actually on interviewing for selection. So like I know way more about interviewing and selection than anybody cares about. The first thing is to really know what you're looking for. That sounds like the obvious answer, but there are a lot of companies that haven't even taken that step yet. Like, are the hiring managers on the same page about what makes a person a good fit for the culture or not? And there's a trend that I kind of dig that's like, don't call it culture fit, call it culture add. Does this person really add to the culture? Because culture fit can be a way for us to unknowingly discriminate against people who just seem like they're different from us. So what is it that you're looking for? I think it's useful to get on the same page about what are some non-negotiables, what are some things that would just qualify somebody. And a lot of that comes through like story and examples. Like what are stories and examples of human behavior that are a great example of what we're looking for this culture? And what are some stories and examples of this is not okay? And if somebody is going to show up in this manner, they're not going to last here. So having those conversations to begin is important. And it's super geeky and nerdy, but you can actually create criteria around interview questions and interview answers of like what actually constitutes a good answer. Usually you want it to be values driven. Otherwise you're trying to capture too many possibilities under the sun. And I like the idea of having multiple people interview because if they are on the same page, they have unity around what makes somebody a good culture add to our company. But then they also, because they're just different human beings, they bring diversity and perspective. They're going to make higher quality decisions about, is this person somebody we want to bring into the team or not?
I really appreciate that. So I actually wrote down culture add, not culture fit. That was a really, really strong takeaway right there, just because I say culture fit a lot, but does this person add to our culture? I think that's a really good frame to look at something.
Yeah, I wish I could remember where I heard it because I didn't come up with it. But I liked it as well.
Well, I'll give you all the credit. What was the thing you said earlier too, which is I think also really important, and it's played through my mind in my own version of it, but I just want to make sure I heard it correctly. Like the person that does the least, but basically like the lowest point of your culture is what the culture is.
Culture is driven by the worst behavior allowed by leadership.
Okay. Culture. That's like really powerful stuff. Yeah. Culture is driven by worst behavior allowed.
Those are.
So we had something come up this week, and when you said that, it hit home. Like it hit me in the heart because I felt like we've been really lenient on stuff because that's kind of a way of us to be competitive. I think is to like allow some sort of flexibility within our organization, and I think too much of it can bite us in the ass. So we're trying to find that perfect area, and something happened this week. And I was like, this is what we get. This is the downside of us having this culture. And it really matches up with what you said. So,
well, and can I share one more thing around that I thought was cool? So people actually tend to really appreciate having guardrails. And that's to me, like when you say, this is our culture, here's what's okay, what's not okay, that's what you're doing. You're like, here's the guardrails. Like within these guardrails, do whatever you want. And so you can have that combination of being flexible on the things that you're fine with being flexible on, and you've got your guardrails set for what's genuinely not okay. And there was a study that they did with kids, and I understand like most people employ adults, but kids are just tiny humans. Anyway, they took these kids, and in one case, they were out on a playground with a teacher where there was no fence. There was no fence around the playground, and it was like an unfamiliar playground. And the kids kind of just like huddled near the teacher. They really barely kind of strayed to play on the equipment. They just really wanted to stay near. And then in another condition, a teacher took kids to a playground that had a fence, a clearly defined fence and a boundary. And those kids had way more fun. Like nobody was huddling around the teacher. Everybody stayed within the fenced area, but like they played. And so having those guardrails actually creates freedom for people, which is very counterintuitive. But if people don't know what's okay or not okay, metaphorically, they're going to like huddle near the teacher. So in an organization, they might like constantly come back to you as a leader and go, is this okay? Can I do this? Can I do this? Or they just sort of like watch and they're trying to figure it out. If you communicate what's okay, what's not okay, you put those guardrails up, people are like, awesome. All right. As long as I know my limits, like I'm going to roam free now. So that's one of those counterintuitive things that helps leaders feel better about like really being clear about some of those boundaries.
That's super impactful for me because again, and maybe there's some business opportunity for us, even if you even want to work with me after the conversation. But essentially what I've learned with my founders group is it's a bunch of high level people that have like aren't used to being told what to do. And I realized after this last meetup, I'm like, we are going to have very strict rules moving forward. I even communicated that at the end of day 2 because, for example, and again, we say we're starting at 10, people show up at 10:10. We say we're starting at 11, people show up at 11:10. Like it's like clockwork. Like it ends up just being like too loosey goosey. So I don't know what it is, but like little stuff like banning phones. If we're shutting the doors at 10 or like stuff like that. I realized I have to do because if not, it's a bunch of people that are not told what to do in every area of their life. And they're just like going to kind of coast if those guardrails. I think that's I'm going to start using that term instead of rules. I think that's a good term to take.
Yeah.
So, well, very grateful. And thanks for getting in the mud with me for a little bit.
Thanks for all the thought-provoking conversation.
That was fun.
It was fun. Like,
yeah, I'm glad
we went to a lot more places than I often go in these kind of podcast interviews.
So that's the point, by the way, of that's like my whole mission for my podcast and these conversations is to have conversations with people I don't necessarily see eye to eye with. So I'm glad we were able to talk some biz. And yeah, I'm gonna stop the recording now, but if you can stay on for a minute right after, I wanted to ask you something. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Jeremy.